Welcome to this video where I want to introduce you to Nuxt.js. Now, what is Nuxt.js? Nuxt.js is a library for Vue.js. So let's quickly have a look at this first. What is Vue.js? Now, I already got a series and a course on that, which I strongly recommend checking out before diving into Nuxt.js, but here's the brief overview. Vue.js is a front-end JavaScript framework. You use it to build single-page applications or to enhance existing multi-page applications by controlling parts of your page or the entire page through JavaScript, and there specifically through Vue.js, which gives you a lot of helper and utility functions that makes the creation of front-end applications running in the browser easier. Now, it's a mixture of Angular and React from a syntax perspective, you could say. It allows you, as I said, to build widgets and single-page applications. It includes a router and a state management system, Vuex, hence turning it or making it a real complete framework and not just a library for building components as React would be one. It's very lightweight, that's a huge plus of Vue.js, and it is extremely popular. Now, you might already know all of that, so let's now dive into Nuxt.js. What is that? As I said, it's a library building up on Vue.js, and that is super important to understand. The question, of course, just is, why do I need a framework for a framework? If Vue.js already makes the development of JavaScript apps easier, what's the idea behind Nuxt? Does it make the development of Vue.js applications easier? The answer would be yes, it simplifies the development of Vue.js applications, and not because Vue.js is so difficult, it actually isn't, but because there are some things which can be made easier. For example, that's one major focus of Nuxt.js, the creation of universal apps. With universal, I simply mean apps that are also rendered on the server. Now, that is important to understand as it's often misunderstood. We don't use Vue.js and we also don't use Nuxt.js on the server as we do use Express or Hoppy or Adonis.js or something like that. It's not a server-side framework. It just allows us to pre-render views on the fly on the server. So if you're visiting some page in your Vue.js single-page application and you enter a URL, typically what you get is the index.html file and then a single-page application where everything is rendered in the browser. Now you can pre-render things, as I said, on the fly on the server, and Nuxt.js makes that easier. More on that in a second. Another thing where Nuxt.js helps us and makes things easier is the setup of routes and of the entire project in general. In Nuxt.js applications, you configure a lot simply by creating a folder structure with files in it. For example, routing. As you will see in this video, you simply create a bunch of folders and subfolders, and these will be converted into your routes of your Vue application. Because that's another important thing, you still build a Vue application in the end. Nuxt builds up on Vue. It doesn't replace it. So we stick to the Vue world, but gain some extra tools and utilities. So in the end, it simplifies the development of Vue apps. It's totally optional, and since it mostly simplifies things during the development, it also doesn't add much to the file size of your project, so you don't gain a lot of weight. You simply just gain a lot of features during development while still deploying a Vue app in the end, with some overhead, with some extra kilobytes to be downloaded, but also with some new capabilities like the server-side rendering. Now, let's dive into all of that and let's take a closer look at how this works in reality and not just on the slide. However, there is one more thing I want to show you on a slide, and that's the server-side rendering part, because it's so crucial to get that right. I already said, we're building a single-page application with Vue.js. So we're building an application that runs in the browser. That's super important to understand. It's a client-side framework. How does server-side rendering fit in there? Let's consider this case. We have our user, you, and you're visiting a website which is built with Vue.js. So you send a request to a server by entering a URL, for example. Now, typically, you would get back a response, and if you have a single-page application, that response is the index.html file, which contains your Vue app. It contains a bunch of scripts importing the Vue app, you could say. From that point on, everything runs in the browser, and if you click around in that application, you never send a new request, you never send or get back a new response, or if you do, these will be behind-the-scenes AJAX requests and responses. So you always stay on that index.html file, and the Vue app, the Vue.js framework, simply re-renders the parts of your page that need to be re-rendered to reflect the new URL you are now on, even though it's technically the same page. Now, the problem with single-page applications is that if you have a page, let's say a blog, where you get a lot of posts that are fetched from a database. What would happen is that you got the index.html file with the Vue app, and once it starts in the browser, once it runs in your browser, it starts fetching the blog posts behind the scenes with an AJAX request, and it will render them to the screen once they're there. From a UI or from a user experience perspective, that is fine. From a search engine perspective, this is problematic, because the search engine crawler won't wait for the data to return, so all the crawler will see is an empty page, or just the spinner, or whatever you're showing there. Now, this is where server-side rendering can help you. You're not creating a server-side app, you're not having a replacement for Express or something like that here. Instead, the index.html file, which contains your Vue app, can be pre-rendered on the server for each new request. So not when you click around in the app, so when the user is using your page, but whenever a new URL is entered and you hit enter or you hit refresh in your browser. And the search engine crawler effectively does just that. It visits different URLs, and each URL is a brand new fetch of your page. For these requests, we can pre-render the index.html file to execute that initial Vue code that should run not in your browser, but on the server. That is the key thing. We pre-render it on the fly upon the request for the first load only. That's important, for the first load only. Thereafter, we again have a single-page application running in the browser. We still have a normal Vue application. So if you then click around in this pre-rendered page, you still send your AJAX requests and you have Vue manage everything, but that first request is pre-rendered on the server. You can do that without Nuxt.js. You can find a link to the official server-side rendering guide of the Vue.js framework in the description below. But setting it up manually is a lot of work and not that much fun. Nuxt.js helps you with that. That's exactly what Nuxt.js does. It helps you with that pre-rendering of that first initial page. And besides that whole server-side rendering stuff, it also makes the creation of your app simpler because it uses that configure a lot by creating folders and files approach, which we'll have a look at. So this is what Nuxt.js does. This is what the server-side rendering does mean here. Now let's take a look and let's simply create a Nuxt app to get a better feeling for what happens and to leave that world of theory here. To create a new Nuxt app, I will use create Nuxt app, which is like a CLI, you could say. It is a tool which you execute from the command line, from the terminal on Mac, which makes the creation of Nuxt app simpler. And it's available for, or it will work for both Mac, Linux, and also for Windows, of course, so it works there in all these environments. You can simply Google for create Nuxt app, and you should find this GitHub repository here from the Nuxt community. And on that GitHub page, you can find detailed instructions and also installation instructions. Now, we will actually use a third way of installing it, which you don't see on that page. And we will use Node.js, which you need under all circumstances because the project created with this CLI tool here will have a development server so that you can preview your application. And that development server will use Node.js as a language. So we need Node.js. And you can get it from nodejs.org. There you can simply download the latest version or the long-term stability version if you're facing issues with the latest one. Though, if you don't, then I would recommend using the latest one. And we will use it for the development server and because we're interested in Node's package manager, npm, which I will use to install Create Nuxt app. Once you ran through the Node installer and got npm also installed, you can execute npm install -g create Nuxt app. That's the name of the package, this tool I was just talking about. And on Mac and Linux, you probably need to add a sudo in front of that to get the right permissions. And once that is running, it will download that tool and install it globally on your machine. So you only need to execute this command once and no second time thereafter, unless you want to update it. You can now use it anywhere on your machine. So now it was installed. You can now navigate in the terminal or command prompt into the folder where you want to create your next project. And I already am in this folder. So I will now just run create-nuxt-app. So the name of that package we just installed. My first Nuxt app, or whatever name you want to use. Maybe, since I want to use a very simple recipe application, I will name it recipes, but the name is up to you. You hit enter, and now you're asked a couple of questions like a project name. I'll confirm the default, which you see here between the parentheses with enter. Description, my awesome recipe book app. You can now choose a custom server-side framework, and that can be confusing. Now, I said that Nuxt would not be a replacement for Express and so on, and it isn't. But you can integrate it with Express or also with no server-side framework. In this case, Nuxt will, also for production, not just for development, give you a node server which you deploy, because it, of course, needs a node server to be able to pre-render your pages on the fly. And it only runs on Node. That's also important. You can't use it with PHP or anything like that. So I will use none here. I don't want to have another server-side framework because I don't want to write any server-side code here. I just want to get that pre-rendering capability. So I will pick none here. Now we could also choose a custom UI framework. And these are really component libraries where we could easily integrate things like a date picker and so on into our project. I don't want one of these either, so I will also pick none here. And now we can choose the default rendering mode, which you can change after the project has been created. You could still create a single page application, hence you would not use the server-side rendering capabilities. You would still benefit from that configure everything with files and folders approach. But I also want to get that server-side rendering advantage or feature, so I will pick universal here, which simply means the app then supports both the client and the server-side, though technically it still is a client-side focused app. You just got that server-side pre-rendering capability. So I will pick universal here. Now next, you could automatically include axias into your project. Axias is a JavaScript library which you can use to send AJAX requests. But we can also install that separately if we wanted to. So I will hit no here. You can enable linting here. I will also hit no here. And you can enter your offer name here just to store it in the configuration. Next, you can choose the package manager you want to install if you got multiple ones installed. Now, I also got Yarn installed, but I will stick to NPM. And that will now create a new Nuxt project with the bare minimum settings, which are basically what you will start with in a lot of projects. So let's wait for this to finish, and I will back once it is done. So the setup finished, and now we see the commands we can execute here. So let me navigate into that newly created folder with cd recipes. And now here we can run npm run dev to start that development server. Now this will start at localhost 3000 by default. It also prints the address here. And you can now simply visit that address. So I entered it in the browser, and you should see something like that. A default Nuxt app, basically a starting screen it gives you out of the box. Now let me also quickly open this in an IDE. I will use Visual Studio Code here in this video. And there it should look something like this. This is the folder and file structure a Nuxt project has out of the box. And if you have worked with Vue.js only thus far, then this will look quite differently. The reason for this is you still create a Vue.js application, but a lot of things you had to configure and wire up manually in your Vue apps, mainly related to the routing, is now done for you. The core concept of a Nuxt app, which I absolutely want you to remember, is that pages folder here. In that pages folder, you create your routes by naming your files and folders in there appropriately. Every .vue file in that pages folder will be considered as a route. And you can also nest routes and create more complex paths by creating subfolders. Let me show you what I mean. If I add an about.vue file, and these should be .vue files for normal single file Vue components, as you probably know them from your own Vue project. If you create such a about.vue file, you can simply add a template in there, and in the template you could output an h1 tag where you say the about page. Something like that. Now if I save this about.vue file and I go back to my project here, then I can go to my URL and enter /about. Now this will load this page I just created. You might need to reload once if you just added that page, and it will print out the about page here. So it loads this content, this Vue component here in the about.vue file as my main component through the Vue router behind the scenes, because I added an about.vue file here. Each file is interpreted as a route here. Index simply is the root route for just /nothing, and /about would be forwarded to about.vue. An alternative, by the way, if I cut that content here and remove the file, an alternative is to create a subfolder, about, and in that subfolder I could create an index.vue file again. If I now save this and I reload the previous page, then it will still work because this yields the same result in the end. A folder is also interpreted as a path segment, and the index file in a folder will simply be loaded if you enter nothing else and if you get no other .vue files in that folder. And I personally prefer this folder-based approach because I believe, or I think, it makes the structure a bit more understandable this way. So this is how you create routes, and that is the second core feature of Nuxt.js. We also get a couple of other folders here which you use for different features. We will have a look at some of them in this video. But the pages folder is the most crucial one. You create your routes through the Vue router without writing any single line of configuration code, just by creating folders and files. And now if you inspect the source code of that loaded page by right-clicking and then viewing the page source, then you will see that if you scroll down, that this is actually pre-rendered. You can see it here, the About page. Now this might look trivial because that is what you entered here, right? But if you create a normal Vue app without Nuxt, and you dare inspect your page source, you will basically see an empty index.html file with a bunch of script imports. You see these script imports here too, because after the first load it becomes a single page application. But this first page is pre-rendered on the fly just before you or just right after you request it on the server, as is confirmed by the fact that the content is in the file which you download from the server. If it would be added after the initial load, then the source code wouldn't have been touched because JavaScript changes aren't reflected in there. This is really the file you got from the server. So these are the two main features of Nuxt: the server-side rendering and the navigation or the routing by folders and files. Now let's build up on that and let's create a very, very, very simple page here where we have some recipes to look at. And if you want to learn more about Nuxt and dive a bit deeper, I got a whole course on that where I walk you through the different core features and give you a more thorough introduction to Nuxt.js. A link is of course in the video description. So let's create a new subfolder in the pages folder and let's name it recipes. And in there I'll add an index.vue file. Now my goal is to show very, very simple previews of recipes we could cook in there. And if we click one, we load a detail page, which will also be very simple in this video, but which will allow us to see Nuxt.js in action. So in the index.vue file in the recipes folder, I'll add a template, and in that template here, I want to display my my recipes. So I'll add a section, maybe give that section a class of recipes, and in there I want to have a couple of article elements. So these are normal HTML elements, of course, and each article, let's say, could have like a div where we have a preview image, Could have a h1 tag for the title, and could then maybe have a paragraph where we have some nice preview text. Now, since we're creating a normal Vue application, a new Vue component here in the index.vue file, we can of course also add some styles. And we can add the scoped keyword to scope the styling we set up here to just this component and therefore to this page. So in there, I now want to add my recipes class, which I'm referencing in the template. And in there, I will have my article, which is just a recipe. And actually, I also want to style that. And let's say a recipe has a very simple style, box sizing of a border box to make sure the width and so on is correct. Give it a width of, let's say, 280 pixels maybe. Give it a padding of 8 pixels. Give it a border of 1 pixel solid and a light gray maybe. And some box shadow of 0. Then 2 pixels as a second value. Then maybe 2 pixels again. And a darker gray. Excuse me. Darker gray like this. And the exact styling is of course totally up to you. Now, if we take a very quick look at /recipes like this, and for the first time you need to reload this page, this is what it will look like. Now, I want to have an image above it, and of course I want to have multiple recipes. So let's quickly copy that recipe here, add it below the first one, and save that file. You get live updating here. Always make sure you keep that process running, by the way, which you started with npm run dev. So now we got a second recipe, and I want to position them next to each other. So I'll give the wrapping recipes container here a display of flex to use flexbox, and set the flex flow to row, and give it also the wrap property to make sure we wrap the content if our page width doesn't suffice. So if we are in a smaller page, this will automatically wrap to have very basic responsive styling here. Okay, so these are the two basic recipes. Now I want to have an image. So let's quickly search for food, and feel free to pick any image that looks delicious to you. So we'll grab the URL of this image, which looks quite tasty. And I want to use it as a background image for that div in my recipe here. So why don't we give that div here in both instances a class of thumbnail, and then also inline style, which we can later set dynamically if we want to, which sets a background image where we set some URL like this and simply reference the URL. Now we can style the thumbnail class here to position that background image correctly by setting background position to center and background size maybe to cover. Now if we save this and we go back to our application, we still don't see anything, because what we also need to do is set a width of 100% and a height of, let's say, 200 pixels. If we do that and we go back, we see our image there. Now, this is now my preview image of that recipe. The recipe itself could also use some margin to have some distance to the next recipe, in my opinion. So let's add a margin of 10 pixels to all directions. Looks better. And of course, I want to have a different image for the second recipe. So let's search one other image. Maybe some, no, not this one. This one looks quite good. So with this one selected, let's go back and add it to this URL. And as I said, we can, of course, set this dynamically by binding the style property, just as you can do it in any Vue app. And with that, we got this exchanged. So this is taking shape. Now, one thing I want to do in the recipes here, I want to change the positioning. So I'll set justify content, which is a flexbox property, to center, and align items also to center them horizontally and vertically in their flexbox, not on the entire page. So this gives me this look. So this looks quite nice. Now, one thing we can, of course, do in Nuxt apps too, and that is something I definitely want to show you. We can, of course, still create normal Vue components which are not used as pages to construct our app from them. For that, we got this components folder, and we already start with a logo component. Now, let's get rid of that, and let's create a new .vue file in there. So just an ordinary Vue component as we used it in the pages folder. Components in the components folder, however, will not be treated as routes, but as normal components which you can use anywhere else in your Nuxt application once you registered them. So here I will create my recipe.vue file, and let's follow the styling convention and name this recipe like that. And in there I got a template too, of course, and in this template I now want to use this markup which I used in my index.vue file in the recipes folder. So the code for one single recipe essentially. This is now what I enter in this template here. Now the image, the title, and the preview text, that is something which I expect to get from outside, from the page. So what I'll do is I will add a script section, which we could have also added to the components in the pages folder. Of course, you're just creating a normal Vue component. Now in this script section here, I'll add a props key here to define the props this component expects. And I will use the very short version here. I expect to get a thumbnail, I expect to get a title, and a preview text. Now, with that set up, we can output this with the normal tools Vue gives us. Because that's really important to understand. You're creating a Vue app, so you use the same syntax here. You just got some extra helpers in the form of Nuxt's features. So here I'll output the preview text. And for the title here, I'll output the title property referring to this prop. And for the image here, I'll bind style here to a dynamic value, to a JavaScript object, where I got background image using camel case, since we're now entering some JavaScript snippet in here, and close the object at the end. And here the URL is now something which I get dynamically. First of all, this has to be a string now because it is a JavaScript value assigned to this property in this object. So URL like this. And then I escape here and close it. And in here, I want to enter my thumbnail and close it in this URL. And we need to close that string after the closing parentheses. So now we're assigning a dynamic value to this background image, which we in turn bind in this object to the style property. And now we get a reusable component, which we can use by registering it in our recipes page. In there, to register it, I'll also add a script section like this. And now I can simply import it by writing import recipe from, and now in Nuxt projects, one of the utilities it gives you, you can use @ to refer to the root folder, and therefore next /components/recipe, and omit the .vue. This gives you direct access to this recipe component, which you can now register on the components key in your Vue object here, in your Vue component instance object. So here under components, I can register recipe like that. This allows us to use recipe in the template here. So I replace the article with just recipe, a self-closing element if you want so. And there we can pass the thumbnail. Now for that, it would have been nice to keep the image link. So let's quickly do that. Let's grab that link again. And now do the changes. And now reference thumbnail and set that link. And let's split this over multiple lines to keep it readable. We can also set a title here like delicious pizza and a preview text, which could be awesome pizza. Yeah, it's really descriptive as you can see. Now we can repeat that for the second recipe here. Let's grab that URL, that image URL, and use that here. And now this is not a pizza. This is some seafood salad or something like that. Or is it, I don't know. It's something like that. So seafood salad. Very tasty indeed. And let's remove that article. So now we're mixing Nuxt with something which we already know, reusable components. We know how to use them in a Vue app, don't we? Make sure to save all files, and if you now return, got an error regarding the logo, which is still imported in the main index file. Let's remove it there. Can actually clear the entire stuff down there, the style, the script, and remove the content here in the section. So if you save that updated file, we got that. Now the image is missing. What's broken here? Let's quickly have a look. We got our thumbnail, and we're binding background image to a URL here. And the problem I have, of course, is the styling. We got the styles for the recipe in the recipes index.vue file. Let's cut them from there, the recipe and the thumbnail, and go to the recipe.vue file and add them there, of course. Also scope them. And now enter the styles in there, save that file, and now we're back to where we already were. So now we're having the two recipes here on that page, and we're outputting them there. Now, what if we wanted to click on one of them and then see the details page? For that, we might want to go to something like /recipes/1 for the ID 1. Now, you can also have dynamic paths in Nuxt.js by adding a subfolder, underscore, that is an important part. The underscore in the name of the folder or the file signals to Nuxt that the part after it will be some variable, some dynamic parameter by which you can extract what the user entered. So something like maybe ID underscore ID. In there, I again create the index.vue file. And in that file, for now, I'll simply output a paragraph where I just want to output the ID the user entered. And since it uses the normal Vue router behind the scenes, you can reference $route. That is an object automatically made available by Vue, also in normal Vue apps where you use the router, by the way. And there you will have a params object. And now I can enter or access ID on that params object because that folder is named ID. The underscore is ignored. It just signals to Nuxt that this is a dynamic segment. And then you enter the name, in this case ID, by which you plan on extracting that parameter. And route params is just a default object given to you by the Vue.js router, which Nuxt uses, as I said. With that, if we save that file and we go manually for now to recipes 1, then I output 1 here. Maybe a bit hard to see, but there is a 1. That is that dynamic segment I was referring to. Now, this gives us the opportunity of loading this dynamically. So in here, we could have a section, class, single recipe, and in there, let's say we have a h1 tag where I want to output the title. Then I, let's say, want to output a div where I have my image. And below that, I have a paragraph with the recipe description. And you can, of course, always enter more details. Now, with that, we got a very basic page here without any styling. So let's quickly add some styling with normal CSS. Single recipe here. I'll again use Flexbox to give it some styling. So display is set to flex. And then I'll set the justify content property to center everything again. And so I do for align items to center this too. Now with that, we get some very basic styling, which we can always fine tune later. I also want to align all the text in the center. So let's quickly enter text align center too. And let's maybe give this a padding of 30 pixels if we want to. And now let's make sure we can reach that page without having to enter it manually. So here on the index.vue file in the recipes folder, where we got our recipes, I want to get forwarded to that detail page if we click one of the recipes. Now for that, let's simply assume that each recipe here also receives an ID. Maybe 1 for the first one and 2 for the second one. And in reality, we would of course get that recipe data from a database where we probably also have IDs for all the recipes. Here it's hard-coded, but that's just a simple example here. So we got ID 1 and ID 2 here. And with that, I want to output it, of course. I want to output the ID, or to be precise, I want to output a link which uses that ID. So back in the recipe.vue file here, first of all, I'll add a new prop, which I expect. So I'll expect the ID prop, which we just added. And now I will wrap this entire article in a link. However, not in a normal link, not in an anchor tag, which I write manually, but in a Nuxt link object or component. Now that is, as the name suggests, made available by Nuxt, and it uses the Vue router link behind the scenes. In the end, what this does, or how this works, is you enter a to property with a path you want to navigate to. Now here I will bind this dynamically by adding a colon, and then I want to go to /recipes. This should be a string because we're binding to a JavaScript expression with the colon here. /recipes/ and then I will add the ID. Now with that, if we save this, it looks ugly because of the styling, but you can already see it's a link. And if I click on the first one, I'm taken to the detail page, and the same will be the case for the second one. So this works fine. One thing I do notice is the styling is a bit off. We should set flex flow in that single recipe page to column, to not put it next to each other, but below each other. So now we got the recipe detail pages, and you can see that we can go there with a dynamic path parameter by using that underscore in the folder name. So with all that set up, we got a way of navigating around here in our simple application. Now, of course, we can enhance the styling in the recipe.vue file in the components folder. There, I simply want to change my link, and behind the scenes it will use a normal anchor tag, so we can style that. So in that normal anchor tag, I want to disable text decoration, so set this to none, and I'll set the color to black still, to not have that blue text. Now it's still clickable, but it looks a bit nicer. So now we can go to the detail pages. Now to output something on the detail pages, we simply need to load our data. Now we could use Vuex. You can use Vuex in Nuxt applications too, and a link to instructions on how to use it can be found in the video description, or of course also in that course I mentioned earlier. In this video, I want to load the data from the server. It just as the initial list of recipes. Now we don't do that yet, so for now let's hard-code it, but I'll soon add a way of loading this dynamically. So for now, I simply want to output the ID here so that we can really see a difference by accessing $route. Again, this is provided by the normal Vue router. Params, which is a default object or property of that $route object. And now ID, because the folder is named _ID. Now with that, we can at least see a difference. If we click on that, we see 2 for that recipe and 1 for the other one. Now, as I said a second ago, in reality, you would not hard-code this. You would load it from a server, right? And this is what I also want to do here, or at least what I want to fake. We can add a special method, and let's start with the recipes page. There, in our script, we can add the async data method. Now you might know the normal data method from your old Vue apps. Data was a property, a method, where you return an object which holds data with which you want to initialize your component. And I could hard-code my recipes in there. Nothing wrong with that. However, in Nuxt apps, which are server-side rendered, you got async data as well. Async data is a special method. It's comparable to the normal data. It also initializes your component with some data. But async data is actually executed on the server as well. So if you're in single page mode and you're clicking around, it's executed with each click on the client. But if you're sending a request for a page for the first time, as explained at the beginning of this video, then you will actually execute the code on the server to fetch all the data which needs to be rendered on the page in advance on the server before returning the page, so that you can pre-render the page with the data on the server and send back the finished page to the user. And in this example here, I won't reach out to a server. I will still hardcode some code in here, but you could simply replace this with an axias call or whatever Ajax library you want to use. So you could install axias, import axias, and then make a GET request. And the important thing is, if you have something like a promise, like here for a GET request, you should return it. And Nuxt will automatically wait for this promise to be resolved, take the resolved value, and take it, if it's an object, which it should be, as the initial value or the initial data for this component. Now here I'm not using axias and I'm not using a server, but I want to show this still. So I will simply create a new promise on my own. As you probably know, a promise takes a function as an argument, where we in turn have two arguments, resolve and reject. And you execute these inside of the promise to either resolve or reject it. Now here I will use the normal set timeout method and set a timeout to, let's say, 1.5 seconds. And after that time, this arrow function here will get executed. And in this arrow function, I simply want to resolve some data. And this is really just some code I use to fake an asynchronous request, to fake that we would fetch this data from a server. So in there, I resolve a JavaScript object with, let's say, a recipes property. The name is up to you, which might be an array. And in that array, I want to have my objects. And again, this is really just some dummy data, which you normally, of course, would fetch from a server. Now in there, you might have an ID. Could be anything, could be a number, a long string, something like this here. And you will have a title. So here I will use the delicious pizza title. You will also have your preview text, of course, which is a string. So here I will also use the preview text from above. And you will have your thumbnail, like that. So let's grab this thumbnail link then. Now, of course, we have two recipes here. So let's also enter the second one. There, I will grab the title, which I hard-coded into my template. From the template, I will also grab the hard-coded preview text. And I will also grab the hard-coded image URL. So now this is all coming as it would come from a server in the form of a JavaScript array. And since I returned that promise in async data, Nuxt will wait for this promise to resolve or to fail, and will then merge the data which you resolve, so this object, with the data your component has anyways. Now here we don't have any other data. We could have, and it would be merged. Here, however, this will be our entire component data. The key thing is, in our template, we can use that data because the template will only be rendered once this fetching is done. So there will be a recipes property which we can reference in our template. That means we can remove the second recipe. And for the first one, I'll use v-for and loop through all my recipes in the recipes property. So recipe here, the name, that is up to you. You can name this whatever you want. Could be R, could be recipe. Recipes here, however, is coming from the data of that component. And in our case, that has to be recipes because we get back an object with a recipes property, which will become our component data eventually. So now we also should assign a key. And here we'll just use recipe ID. Each recipe has an ID, don't forget. And now we can really just bind all these values to the dynamic values we're fetching. So in this case, to recipe thumbnail, referring to that thumbnail property we added. And the same, of course, for title and preview text. So for title, it's recipe title, and we should bind it dynamically therefore. For ID, it's recipe ID. And for preview text, it's therefore recipe preview text, like that. If we now save all files and we reload this page, we should still see our recipes. However, if we reload, it takes 1.5 seconds because this is pre-rendered on the server. You can best see it if I open my URL bar and I click the refresh icon. You see it spins and spins, and here the data is, because it waits for this promise to resolve. Now let's fake the same on our detail page. So I'll copy the async data function here and add it to a script in the ID index.vue file. So there I'll also add async data, also have a promise to fake a real request where we get data. And here, of course, I resolve a single recipe. So I resolve an object, which will become my component data, which just has a recipe property, and that should be the recipe we loaded. So here, of course, we got two possible recipes we could fetch. The one with ID 1, which is the delicious pizza, and the other one. And to make this simple, because I don't send a real request to a server, where I could send my route parameter, the ID, to the server to only get back one recipe, I will actually keep the full original code where I get both recipes, but I want to filter for the recipe which matches my route ID. So I will still only get a recipe here, but I got an array here to which I will chain the find method, a default JavaScript array method. Find takes a function as an argument, which will be executed on every object or element in that array, in this case, 2 elements. So it will then execute this function with each element and receive that element as an input to the function. And you should return true if that is the element you wanted to find, and it will then return this element. So recipe will only be one of the 2 elements here. I want to return the element where the ID, each element has an ID property, don't forget, is equal to the ID we entered in our URL. Now in async data, we actually can't access $route because the Vue component hasn't been fully loaded yet, and hence this has not been made available yet. But in async data, you get a special argument passed into by Nuxt.js, the context argument. Context has a couple of convenience properties, holds a lot of useful information. You can find a link to the API documentation in the video description. And in this case, context has a params property, which holds the params it can parse from your URL. In this case, I'm interested in the ID param, and only if that matches the ID of an object here in the array, this will be returned as the recipe which was loaded. So now I can output that here. I can output recipe title here, and here I don't just want to have the preview text, but the full description text. So let's quickly add a new property to both objects. Description text. This is really a delicious meal. And yes, it's the same text for both recipes, but just for demo purposes. So now we can output that here in the paragraph. We can output recipe description text. And for the image, I want to bind this dynamically to recipe thumbnail, and alt could also be bound dynamically to recipe title. Now if we reload that page, we got our recipe here with a rather big image, so maybe we can do something about the size here. Recipe image as a class can be added to the image. And now we can go down to the size and style the recipe image here in the styles to get it, give it a width of 100% and maybe see how that looks like. Still very big, but this is fine in my opinion for a starter. Now this is the delicious pizza, and if I go back and I load the seafood salad, it still takes 1.5 seconds because async data has that promise which resolves only after 1.5 seconds. And then I see the seafood salad. Looks very good to me. So now this is a very simple recipe page, and you always see that waiting time because we're faking that HTTP request we're doing, which runs either in the client if we're clicking around or on the server if we enter a URL for the first time. And with that, we get a very basic Nuxt application showing its core features, server-side rendering, and also the you configure folders and files, and I will give you the REST approach. Now, to finish this very basic app up, I'll add a second component in the components folder. And this will be my header.vue file to have a little navigation bar. There, I will just add a template with a header component. And in there, I'll have a nav component with an unordered list with 2 list items. In each list item, I want to use a Nuxt link. The first one goes to the starting page. The second one goes to my recipes. And actually, I guess we have a third one to the about page. And now we add the to link to all of them. Now, for the first one, it's just slash for the starting page. For the second one, it's recipes. And here it's slash about, referring to the index.vue file for just slash, to recipes index.vue for slash recipes, and to about index.vue for slash about. Now, of course, we need some styling here. So let's add some scoped styling here to style our header appropriately. Maybe make sure that it has a width of 100%, a height of 30 pixels maybe. Let's set display to flex and center everything with justify content center and align items center. And let's then also add some styling to the unordered list. Let's set the list style to none. Remove all padding and margin, and also give it a display of flex to position the individual links next to each other by also adding justify content, and then maybe center to and align items also centered. And then let's go to the list items themselves, and let's each give a margin of 0 to top and bottom, but 10 pixels to left and right to get some spacing between the items. And now let's use that header. And now here's a special trick. We could include it in any page, but of course, all these pages should share the header. And that is where layouts come into play. Each Nuxt page is loaded into this default layout in the position of this Nuxt hook here. And you can also set up some general app styles in the default Vue file. I will keep the ones which were set up, but you can of course set this to your settings or clean it up. Yeah, the thing is, you can add a script section in this layouts default.vue file too. And by the way, you should keep that file because default.vue is something Nuxt will look for as the default layout, you guessed it. And in here, I will import my header from /components header. And I will then add components here, header like this, and add my header with a capital H to not use the default header here. Now, if you save all files, you get the header at the top, and you can indeed navigate around to the different pages. Now, just saw the about page can use some styling. Let's add some styles here too, and simply set some text alignments here for the H1 tag. But the core thing is now, we got our nice header. We can give it a background color of maybe 521751, like this. And now also style our anchor tags here in our header to have a text decoration of none and a color of white maybe. So this looks now much better. And now with that, we have an application where we can navigate around, get a header on each page, and where we take advantage of the core features of Nuxt. Clearly, this is not the most beautiful application you ever built, and clearly, Nuxt has to offer way more than that. But these are the core basics which I wanted to show you, and I hope that this helps you getting started with Nuxt. Now, if you want to dive deeper, you may have a look at my more thorough introduction course on Udemy, or additionally, at the really good official Nuxt documentation, which you can find on Nuxt.js.org. There you find details about all the different features, how to use and configure them, and also about features which I didn't show in this video. I hope you got started with that video though, and I'd of course be more than happy to welcome you in future videos too. Hopefully see you there. Bye.